The Whitaker home in Springfield, Ohio, was quiet except for the clinking of silverware and the faint hum of an old refrigerator in the corner of the kitchen. The table was neatly set, but the atmosphere was heavy, as if every bite of food carried an unspoken tension. Nancy sat opposite her husband, Victor, and next to his mother, Lucille, who had insisted on coming for dinner. Victor's broad frame filled the chair, his shoulders hunched as he spooned another ladle of steaming soup into his bowl. His face was flushed from more than just the heat of the kitchen. Frustration simmered beneath the surface. Across from him, Nancy sat upright, hands folded in her lap, her bank card tucked safely away in her purse resting on the chair beside her. She knew exactly why her mother-in-law had come tonight. Lucille's thin lips pursed into a line as she leaned forward, her voice soft but demanding. "Nancy, dear, you know how expensive my medications are. The pension barely covers groceries. A good daughter-in-law wouldn't hesitate to help." Nancy forced a polite smile, though her stomach churned. She had been here before, countless times. She had bought Lucille new furniture, paid for appliances, and even taken unpaid leave to drive her to a rehabilitation clinic after surgery. But tonight, something in her felt different. She pressed her fingers tighter against her lap and shook her head slowly. "Lucille, I can't give you my card. We've already spent so much this month. I need to manage what little is left." Victor's spoon clattered against the edge of his bowl. His eyes darkened as he turned toward her, a sharpness in his gaze that made her chest tighten. "You'll hand over that card tonight," he growled, "or you can pack your things and leave this house." Nancy blinked, stunned by the bluntness of the ultimatum. 23 years of marriage, and never had he spoken so coldly, so decisively. She barely had time to process the words before it happened. Victor reached across the table, his massive hand gripping the bowl. With a sudden motion, he tipped it forward. The soup poured over her blouse, scalding hot as it soaked through the thin fabric and seared her skin. She gasped, the pain immediate and fierce, a fiery sting racing across her chest. Her chair scraped against the floor as she bolted upright, clutching a napkin in vain to wipe away the liquid that only spread the burn deeper. The room was silent except for her sharp breaths. Victor towered over her, his face red with rage. "I told you," he spat. "You either give her the card or you're out." Lucille's eyes lingered on her daughter-in-law's trembling form. Instead of concern, a flicker of satisfaction crossed her features, almost a smirk, before she masked it with a practiced sigh. "Nancy, really, is it so hard to help an old woman?" Her tone was syrupy sweet, laced with venom. Nancy's hands shook as she dabbed at her blouse, the fabric sticking to her skin. The sting was unbearable, but worse than the pain was the humiliation, the realization that the two people at this table, who should have been her family, looked at her not with love but with contempt. For the first time in all the years she had lived with Victor, a cold wave of fear rippled through her. She saw something in his eyes that night that she had never wanted to believe existed. Something cruel, something dangerous. The man she had once trusted, the man she had built her life with, had become a stranger capable of deliberate harm. She stumbled backward, clutching her chest. Without another word, she turned and walked quickly toward the bathroom, ignoring the sound of Victor's derisive laugh and Lucille's murmured complaint that she was too dramatic. The bathroom door clicked shut, and for the first time, Nancy slid the lock into place. Inside, the fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the small space. She peeled the soaked blouse from her body, wincing as the fabric tugged against the reddened skin beneath. Turning on the faucet, she let cold water run over the burns, her reflection staring back at her in the mirror. The woman who looked back at her seemed unfamiliar, eyes wide and wet with unshed tears, shoulders hunched in defeat, lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. She searched her own face as if it belonged to someone else. "How did I end up here?" she whispered to the mirror, her voice barely audible over the rush of water. How did my life become this? The sting of the burn was sharp, but the ache in her chest was sharper still. 23 years of sacrifice, of silence, of swallowing her words to keep the peace. Yet tonight, with one violent act, the illusion had shattered. Nancy pressed the cool washcloth against her chest, closed her eyes, and let the tears fall. The woman in the mirror no longer looked like the girl who once dreamed of writing stories, who believed in love, who thought she would be cherished. This woman was tired, frightened, and painfully aware that something in her life had to change. Nancy stayed in the bathroom longer than she needed to, pressing a cool cloth to her burns until the sting dulled. But it wasn't just her skin that hurt. A deeper wound throbbed in her chest, the kind that came from years of silence, from swallowing her dreams until they became unrecognizable. Her reflection in the mirror blurred with tears, and suddenly she was no longer the tired woman in her 40s, staring back at her. She was 19 again, sitting on the steps outside the old library at Ohio State, a notebook balanced on her knees. Back then, her handwriting flowed across the page like water. She had stories to tell, dozens of them, and she believed with all her heart that one day she would be published. Victor had been different then. He wasn't the man who had just hurled scalding soup at her. He was the boy with dark hair and a crooked smile who leaned against the rail and told her, "Nancy, you've got talent. People are going to want to read what you write." She remembered how those words lit something inside her, how she clung to them when the world seemed too big and her own voice too small. For a long time, she believed he saw her, that he valued her mind, her imagination. But years blurred one into the next, and her notebooks were replaced by grocery lists, utility bills, and check registers. The only pages she filled were the ones Lucille shoved at her, statements for bank withdrawals, receipts for furniture Lucille wanted, medical expenses she insisted Nancy cover. Somewhere along the way, Nancy had stopped being Victor's partner and had become his mother's provider, her walking ATM. The realization stung worse than the burn on her chest. She pressed the cloth harder against her skin, as if pressure could smother the truth. She wasn't living the life she had dreamed of. She was existing, paying bills, cooking meals, making herself smaller so others could take more. Her mind drifted to a phone call she had received just last week, one she hadn't dared to tell Victor about. Ellie Carter, her old college roommate, the one who used to sneak into late-night writing workshops with her, had called out of the blue. "Do you still write?" Ellie had asked, her voice bright, filled with the kind of warmth Nancy hadn't felt in years. Nancy had hesitated, her throat tightening around the answer. "Not really. Life got busy." "Busy," Ellie repeated gently, not unkind. "Nancy, you used to dream bigger than anyone I knew. Don't tell me that girl is gone." The call had ended with Nancy making excuses about timing, about Victor, about obligations she couldn't shake. But after she hung up, she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank wall. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of everything she had given up and the crushing loneliness of realizing no one had noticed but her. Now, standing in the bathroom, the echo of Ellie's words mingled with the sting of the soup and the memory of Victor's cold stare. "Don't tell me that girl is gone." Was she? Nancy wrapped her arms around herself, the damp washcloth slipping to the sink. A sob tore from her throat before she could stop it. She had let herself be isolated, first gently, then completely. Old friends stopped calling after too many declined invitations. Family visits grew rarer when Victor dismissed them with excuses. And Nancy, too weary to fight, had allowed it. She had been walled in, brick by brick, until the world outside their home felt unreachable. The shame of it burned hotter than the soup. She wasn't just humiliated by Victor's cruelty or Lucille's scorn. She was ashamed of herself, ashamed that she had abandoned the young woman with a notebook, the girl who once believed her words mattered. She turned back to the mirror, meeting her own swollen eyes. The woman who stared back looked older, worn down but still alive. And in that faint flicker of recognition, Nancy realized something she had been too afraid to admit. Her life didn't have to end in this bathroom, in this house with these people. For the first time in 23 years, the thought didn't terrify her. It electrified her. When Nancy stepped out of the bathroom, her blouse clinging damply to her skin, Victor was waiting in the hallway. His face was a mask of impatience, his jaw clenched tight. Lucille hovered behind him, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of disdain and triumph. Victor's voice was low, but sharp as a blade. Either you hand over that card, or you pack your things and get out. I'm done asking nicely. For a moment, Nancy just stared at him. The man who had once encouraged her to write now stood before her like an adversary, a stranger who wanted to strip away what little she had left of herself. She realized there was no softness left in him, no trace of the boy she had once trusted with her future. She walked past him without a word, her heart pounding, her body trembling from both the burn and the adrenaline. In the bedroom, she pulled an old suitcase from the closet, the same one she had carried to college decades ago. The zipper was stiff, but it opened with a tug, releasing the faint scent of mothballs. She began placing clothes inside, each folded shirt and skirt a silent declaration. She was leaving. Victor followed her into the room, his shadow stretching across the floor. "You think you can just walk out?" he demanded, his voice dripping with contempt. "Go ahead, Nancy. Run to your little friend. You'll come crawling back once you realize you can't make it on your own." Lucille's voice floated from the doorway, sharp and amused. "Don't bother Victor. She's just throwing a tantrum. She'll be back in a few days. They always come back." Nancy paused, her hands gripping the edge of the suitcase. Their laughter, his mocking, her smug certainty, echoed around her, fueling the fire that had been lit in the bathroom mirror. She turned slowly, meeting Victor's eyes. For the first time in years, she didn't look away. "I'm not your servant," she said quietly but firmly. Her voice didn't shake. "And I'm not your mother's bank account. I'm done." Victor smirked, as if her words were nothing more than a child's protest. "You won't last a week out there." "Maybe not," Nancy admitted, her tone steady. "But I'd rather struggle alone than keep dying here every day." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the click of the suitcase latches snapping shut. Nancy pulled the handle upright and rolled it across the floor. With each step, the weight on her shoulders seemed to shift, not gone, not yet, but moving with her instead of against her. In the living room, she grabbed her purse, her keys jangling inside. Victor leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching her with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Lucille shook her head, muttering under her breath about ungrateful women and disrespectful wives. Nancy ignored them both. She opened the front door, the night air spilling in, cool and sharp. For the first time in years, she felt the possibility of freedom brushing against her skin. She stepped outside, the suitcase wheels rattling against the porch steps. Once in her car, she pulled the door shut and sat still for a long moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel. Her chest still ached where the soup had burned her, but the deeper ache, the years of silence, of being dismissed and diminished, was harder to bear. She exhaled slowly, forcing back the tears threatening to fall. Her phone buzzed in her purse. She reached for it with shaking fingers and scrolled to Ellie's name. With one press, the line connected. "Ellie." Nancy's voice cracked, raw and fragile. "I need your help." There was no hesitation on the other end. Ellie's voice was warm, steady, a lifeline stretched across the miles. "Come here, right now. My door is open." Nancy closed her eyes, the weight of the past 23 years pressing down and then, little by little, lifting. She turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and with it, a fragile sense of resolve. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was leaving. By the time Nancy pulled into Ellie Carter's driveway, the night air had cooled enough to sting against her damp blouse. The modest white house stood, with its porch light glowing warmly, a stark contrast to the dark silence she had left behind in Springfield. As she stepped out of the car, suitcase in hand, the door opened before she could even knock. "Nancy," Ellie said, her voice full of relief, as though she had been waiting all evening. She crossed the porch quickly and wrapped her arms around her old friend. For a moment, Nancy couldn't speak. She sank into the embrace, her suitcase slipping to the ground as the tension in her body began to unravel. Inside, the home smelled of baked bread and coffee. The walls were lined with bookshelves and framed photographs, a space that radiated warmth and belonging. Nancy's chest tightened as she realized how long it had been since she had felt this kind of welcome. "Sit down," Ellie urged, guiding her to the kitchen table. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, filling the room with a rich, savory aroma. Ellie ladled some into a bowl and set it in front of her, sliding a plate of freshly baked rolls across the table. Nancy hesitated, but the smell was too inviting. She took a bite, and the flavors, simple, hearty, comforting, brought tears to her eyes. The food wasn't extravagant, but it tasted of home, of safety. Something inside her broke open. Her fork clattered against the plate as the tears came in full, uncontrollable waves. Ellie rushed to her side, pulling Nancy into her arms once again. "Let it out," she whispered, holding her as Nancy sobbed against her shoulder. Years of silence, of swallowing pain, poured out in that small kitchen, and for the first time in decades, Nancy didn't try to stop it. When the tears finally subsided, Ellie poured her a cup of tea and sat across from her. "I know it feels impossible right now," she began softly, "but I've been where you are." Nancy lifted her head, her red eyes searching Ellie's calm face. "I stayed too long in a marriage that drained me," Ellie continued. "I thought I was nothing without him, that I couldn't survive on my own. But when I finally walked away, it was like breathing fresh air after years in a locked room." Nancy swallowed, her hands trembling around the warm mug. "How did you do it? How did you find the strength?" Ellie smiled faintly. "At first, I didn't think I had any. I cried for weeks, but then I started writing again. Do you remember in college how we used to sneak into that creative writing seminar?" A faint memory stirred in Nancy's mind. Late nights spent scribbling stories, sharing dreams, believing the world was wide and waiting for them. She nodded slowly. "That's what saved me," Ellie said. "I picked up a pen and I didn't stop. I self-published my first book 2 years later. It wasn't easy, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, I felt alive again." Nancy stared at her friend, mingling with sorrow. She remembered the call Ellie had made just days earlier, urging her not to give up on herself. Back then, Nancy had brushed it off, too afraid to hope. But now, sitting in this warm kitchen, the possibility didn't feel as distant. "You can start over, Nancy," Ellie said firmly, her hand covering hers on the table. "It won't be easy, but you don't have to keep living like you did. You're stronger than you think." Nancy's throat tightened. The words sank deep, stirring something fragile yet persistent inside her. She wanted to believe it, that she could still begin again, that the girl with the notebook wasn't gone forever. She glanced around Ellie's home, at the books, the warmth, the life her friend had built from ashes. For the first time in years, Nancy allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by fear or servitude. Ellie squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight. Just rest. You're safe here." Nancy nodded, her eyes brimming with fresh tears, this time not of despair but of fragile hope. She had walked away with nothing but a suitcase, yet in this kitchen, with Ellie's steady voice reminding her of who she used to be, she felt something she hadn't in years, the faint but undeniable stirrings of possibility. The next morning, Sunlight streamed softly through the lace curtains in Ellie's guest room. Nancy stirred awake, her body sore from the previous night's ordeal, but her mind more unsettled than anything else. The suitcase sat in the corner, half unpacked, a reminder that this wasn't her home. Not yet. Ellie knocked gently before pushing the door open, carrying a tray with toast and coffee. "You need your strength," she said, setting it on the nightstand. "We have a lot to talk about." Nancy sat up slowly, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. "I don't even know where to start." "That's why I'm here," Ellie replied. She pulled up a chair and leaned forward, her eyes steady. "The first thing is your documents. Your driver's license, social security card, employment records. Anything Victor might try to withhold. Without them, you can't move forward legally or financially." Nancy felt her chest tighten. Victor had always kept the important papers in a locked drawer in their bedroom, insisting he was better at handling details. She had let it slide for years, until it became habit. Now the thought of confronting him for them made her stomach twist. He'll never hand them over willingly. "Then we'll do it the right way," Ellie assured her. "I know someone at the precinct. Officer Daniels. He's worked with women in situations like yours before. We'll go together, explain what's happening, and make a plan. That way Victor can't accuse you of theft or trespassing." The mention of the police made Nancy uneasy. She had never considered herself the kind of woman who would need legal protection. But the image of soup dripping down her blouse, Victor's cold command in her ears, and Lucille's smirk hardened her resolve. "All right," she whispered. Ellie reached across and squeezed her hand. "Good. One step at a time." After breakfast, they moved into the kitchen, spreading papers across the table. Brochures, job postings, rental listings. Ellie's pen scribbled notes in the margins as she explained. "I know a landlord who rents small apartments near downtown. It's not glamorous, but it's safe and it's yours. Independence starts with your own space." Nancy traced her finger over the faded photo of a one-bedroom apartment. The rent seemed overwhelming on paper, especially without Victor's paycheck supplementing the household. But Ellie's steady presence kept her from panicking. "As for work," Ellie continued, "you have more options than you think. Remember the editing skills you used to have? A friend of mine runs a small publishing house. They're looking for part-time help. It's not much money to start, but it's a foot in the door." Nancy's breath caught. The idea of working with books again, after years of burying her love of words beneath household chores, was almost too much to hope for. "Do you really think I could do it?" Ellie smiled. "I know you can. I've read your writing, Nancy. That talent doesn't just disappear. You just need a chance." The conversation stretched into the afternoon, weaving through practicalities and possibilities. Every time Nancy's fear threatened to overwhelm her, Ellie redirected her to a small, achievable step. Call Officer Daniels, view the apartment, draft a resume. Piece by piece, the overwhelming mountain of change began to look like a series of manageable hills. Still, doubt lingered. What if Victor comes after me? What if he makes things worse? "He'll try," Ellie admitted honestly. "But with a police report on file and with you standing firm, he can't control you the way he used to. This is about taking back your life, Nancy. Not in one grand gesture, but in steady steps." Nancy inhaled shakily, her eyes fixed on the sunlight spilling across the kitchen table. Fear gnawed at her edges, but beneath it was something else, something unfamiliar, yet quietly insistent. Hope. 2 days later, Nancy stood at the edge of the driveway she had walked up thousands of times before, her heart hammering in her chest. The house looked the same, peeling shutters, the front porch sagging slightly, but everything about it felt hostile now. Beside her stood Ellie, steady as ever, and Officer Daniels, a tall man with graying hair who projected calm authority. "Just remember," Daniels said, his voice even, "you're here legally. You have every right to retrieve your personal documents and belongings. If your husband refuses, we'll file the proper paperwork. Don't let him intimidate you." Nancy nodded, though her hands trembled around the strap of her purse. When the front door creaked open, Victor appeared, his expression darkening as he registered the visitors on his porch. "Well, well," he drawled. "Look who decided to come crawling back, with backup no less." Nancy swallowed hard, but Daniels stepped forward. "Mr. Whitaker, we're here so Nancy can collect her personal documents and belongings. I expect your cooperation." Victor's laugh was sharp, almost mocking. "Documents? She doesn't need anything. Everything she had was mine, too." His gaze flicked to Nancy, cold and taunting. "You walked out, remember? You don't get to waltz back in like nothing happened." Ellie crossed her arms, her tone clipped. "We're not here to argue, Victor. She needs her driver's license, her social security card, her employment records, things she legally owns." At the mention of employment records, Victor's eyes narrowed. "Employment records? Don't know what you're talking about." Nancy's chest tightened. She had watched him place those papers in the locked drawer years ago, insisting he would keep them safe. "They're in the bedroom, bottom drawer of the dresser," she said quietly, forcing the words out. Victor's smirk widened. "Funny, I don't recall any such thing. Maybe you imagined it, Nancy. You've always been dramatic." Before Nancy could respond, Lucille's voice cut through from the kitchen. "So the runaway has returned. I thought you'd at least have the decency to stay gone." She shuffled into view, her sharp eyes scanning the group. When they landed on Officer Daniels, her lip curled. "Bringing the police now? How pathetic. What kind of wife calls the law on her own husband?" Daniels remained unshaken. "Ma'am, this is a lawful matter. I suggest you let us proceed." But Lucille wasn't finished. She leaned toward Nancy, her voice dripping with contempt. "You always were ungrateful. Victor put a roof over your head, food on your table, and you repay him with this? You don't deserve this family." The words struck deep, but Nancy forced herself to stand straighter. She had heard those accusations too many times to let them break her now. Officer Daniels gestured toward the hallway. "Show us the bedroom, Nancy." Nancy led the way, her pulse thrumming. The familiar walls seemed to close in on her, each step reminding her of the years spent here, the dreams she had buried within these rooms. In the bedroom, she went straight to the dresser, pulling at the bottom drawer. Empty. Her breath caught. She rifled through the other drawers, hands shaking, but there was nothing. No records, no envelope, nothing. Victor leaned casually against the doorframe, arms folded, amusement etched on his face. "Told you, no such thing exists." Ellie's voice was sharp with outrage. "Victor, you're lying. You know exactly what was here." "Prove it," he shot back, his grin widening. Nancy's knees weakened as her gaze swept the room. That drawer had once held more than just papers. It had held the stack of notebooks she had guarded like treasure, the stories she had poured herself into late at night, when Victor and Lucille were asleep. Years of writing, her one tether to the girl she used to be. Now, the space where they had sat was barren. Her vision blurred as realization struck. "My notebooks," she whispered, her voice breaking. She yanked open the closet, the nightstand, every drawer, desperation clawing at her chest. But they were gone. Every page, every story, every piece of herself she had dared to preserve gone. Victor's laugh cut through the air like glass shattering. "Oh, those old scraps? Worthless junk. I threw them out weeks ago. Did you really think anyone cared about your silly scribbles?" The room spun around her. Her throat tightened as if the air itself was collapsing. Those notebooks had been her lifeline, her secret rebellion, the last piece of her she hadn't surrendered. And now, they were ash in some dumpster, destroyed by the very man who once claimed to love her. Nancy pressed a hand to her mouth. the sob tearing free despite her effort to hold it in. The loss hit harder than the burns, harder than the insults. It was as if Victor had reached into her chest and ripped out the one thing that was truly hers. Ellie was beside her in an instant, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Nancy, look at me," she said firmly. "He can't erase you. Not really. Those words were inside you once, and they're still inside you now." But Nancy couldn't answer. She sank to her knees, staring at the empty drawer, her tears falling freely. All she could think was that her soul, her voice, had been silenced. Nancy's hands trembled as she zipped a small duffel bag filled with the few things she had managed to recover. Officer Daniels had stood by while she gathered them. Her driver's license, social security card, a stack of old family photographs she found in a shoebox, and a handful of trinkets tucked away in the closet. Nothing compared to the notebooks that were gone forever, but they were hers. At least these pieces of her past had survived Victor's disdain. The weight of the loss still pressed hard on her chest as she stepped out of the house. Lucille muttered curses under her breath, and Victor smirked from the doorway, but Nancy no longer answered them. She clutched the bag to her chest like armor, her silence speaking louder than anything she could have said. Outside, the crisp Ohio air cooled her burning cheeks. Ellie was waiting by the car, her eyes soft with concern. "You got some of what you needed," she said gently, opening the trunk. Nancy nodded, though her throat ached. "Not everything. Not the most important things." "I know," Ellie whispered, squeezing her arm as they climbed into the car. Officer Daniels gave a brief nod of reassurance before driving away, leaving the two women alone in the fading afternoon light. The ride back was quiet, broken only by the hum of the tires against the asphalt. Nancy stared out the window at the passing houses, the manicured lawns, and fading holiday decorations. She felt suspended between two worlds, one she had finally walked out of, and another she hadn't yet built. When they arrived at Ellie's home, Nancy carried the bag inside and set it carefully in the guest room. She sat on the bed, her shoulders slumping under the weight of exhaustion. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they didn't fall. They hovered there, restrained by something new she couldn't quite name. Ellie entered quietly, two steaming mugs of tea in her hands. She handed one to Nancy and sat beside her. "It hurts," Ellie said simply. "Losing those notebooks, I know. They were a part of you." Nancy's voice cracked as she answered. "They were my life. Every thought I was too afraid to say out loud. I put them there, and now they're gone." Ellie let the silence stretch before replying. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the old has to be cleared away so the new can take root. Maybe those pages are gone because you're meant to write something even stronger now." Nancy shook her head, her grip tightening on the mug. "I don't know if I can. I feel empty." "You're not empty," Ellie countered gently. "You're grieving. That's different. And grief means there was love, for your words, for your voice. That love is still in you, Nancy. You just have to let it rise again." The words settled between them, quiet but insistent. Nancy stared down at the tea, watching the steam curl into the air. She remembered late nights in college, scribbling words by the glow of a desk lamp, her heart racing with possibility. She remembered the feeling of creating worlds that belonged only to her. The memory was faint, fragile, but it was still there. For the first time since Victor's cruel laugh in the bedroom, Nancy felt something stir within her. It wasn't confidence, not yet. It was smaller, like a spark buried under ashes, but it was real. She set the mug on the nightstand and leaned back against the pillows, her body still aching but her mind beginning to shift. Maybe Ellie was right. Maybe the destruction of her old words wasn't the end but the beginning of something she hadn't dared to imagine yet. Ellie squeezed her hand once more before standing. "Rest. Tomorrow is a new day. You've already taken the hardest step walking away. The rest will follow." As the room grew quiet again, Nancy closed her eyes. The grief of what she had lost pressed in heavy waves, But underneath, something else whispered, the possibility of starting again. For the first time in decades, she allowed herself to consider it. She could write again. It was only a week after Nancy had moved in with Ellie when the phone call came. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was official and cool. Mrs. Whitaker, this is the Springfield Police Precinct. We need you to come in to answer a complaint filed against you. Nancy's stomach dropped. Her fingers tightened around the receiver. What complaint? Your husband, Mr. Victor Whitaker, has filed a report alleging theft of marital property, the officer explained. You'll need to provide your statement. Her hands went cold, the air suddenly too thin. She managed a strained, I'll be there, before hanging up. Ellie, who had been sitting across the table working on her laptop, immediately noticed her friend's pale face. What happened? Nancy relayed the conversation, her voice trembling. He's accusing me of stealing. I knew he wouldn't let me go, but this… Ellie, what if people believe him? What if everyone thinks I'm a thief? Ellie reached across the table and gripped her hand firmly. Breathe. That's exactly what he wants, to scare you, to make you doubt yourself. But remember, you didn't take anything that wasn't yours. We'll go together. The following morning, the precinct loomed ahead, its brick facade stark against the gray Ohio sky. Nancy's legs felt heavy as she climbed the steps, Ellie's steady presence beside her the only thing keeping her from turning back. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed, and the faint smell of coffee and paperwork lingered in the air. At the front desk, the officer directed them to an interview room. Nancy's palms sweated as she sat at the metal table, her mind racing with images of neighbors whispering, headlines branding her a criminal. For 23 years, she had lived quietly, dutifully. The thought of her name being tainted now filled her with dread. An officer entered, clipboard in hand. He introduced himself calmly and took a seat. Mrs. Whitaker, your husband has alleged that you removed property from the marital home without consent, items of financial and personal value. Nancy's throat tightened. The only things I took were my identification, my social security card, some photographs, and a few personal belongings, she said, her voice wavering at first but gaining steadiness. Officer Daniels was present the entire time. He can confirm it. The officer nodded, jotting notes. He did mention Officer Daniels was there. That helps clarify things. Did you take any items belonging solely to Mr. Whitaker? No, Nancy said firmly, finally lifting her eyes. Nothing that wasn't mine. Ellie leaned forward slightly, her voice even, but protective. She's telling the truth. This accusation is nothing more than an attempt to harass her. The officer regarded them for a moment before setting his pen down. Mr. Whitaker provided no inventory list, no receipts, no evidence to support his claim. Given the presence of a police officer during your retrieval, there's no grounds to pursue this complaint. As far as the precinct is concerned, the matter is closed. Nancy exhaled shakily, her shoulders sagging with relief. But even as the words settled, the tremor in her chest remained. She had braced herself for humiliation, for judgment, only to find the system siding with her this time. Still, the experience rattled her. As they walked back into the parking lot, Nancy wrapped her arms tightly around herself. He's never going to stop, is he? He'll keep finding ways to hurt me. Ellie turned to face her, eyes steady. He'll try, because he doesn't know how else to live without control. But you're not the same woman he thinks you are, and you're not alone anymore. Nancy looked at her friend, the morning wind lifting strands of hair from her face. The fear still pulsed inside her, but beside it, another truth was forming. Victor could lie, could scheme, could claw at her reputation. But for the first time in decades, she wasn't standing defenseless. She wasn't alone. That night, Nancy lay awake in the guest room at Ellie's, the house silent except for the faint hum of the furnace. The day's events replayed in her mind. Victor's false accusations, the sterile precinct room, the relief when the complaint was dismissed. Exhaustion eventually pulled her under, and when she dreamed, it wasn't of Victor or Lucille. It was of her mother. She saw herself as a little girl, sitting at the kitchen table of her childhood home in Springfield, crayons scattered across the surface. Her mother stood behind her, hands on her shoulders, looking down at the crooked letters Nancy had written. "You have a gift, sweetheart," her mother had said, her voice warm, encouraging. "Don't ever be afraid to use it." In the dream, her mother's face was softer than Nancy remembered, but her eyes held the same gentle fire. "Stand up," she whispered, her hand brushing Nancy's hair like it used to when she was small. "Don't let them take your voice. It's still yours." Nancy jolted awake, her heart racing, tears stinging her eyes. The room was dark, but her mother's words lingered, echoing through her chest like a command. She sat upright, clutching the blanket, the ache of longing mingling with a strange, fragile determination. By morning, the dream still clung to her. She found Ellie already in the kitchen, a pot of coffee brewing and a stack of papers spread across the table. Ellie glanced up, a knowing look in her eyes. "You didn't sleep well," she said gently. Nancy shook her head, sliding into a chair. "I dreamed of my mom. She told me not to give up." Ellie reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "Then maybe that's your answer." Nancy's gaze fell to the papers. "What's all this?" "I made some calls," Ellie said matter-of-factly. "There's a small publishing house downtown. They're looking for someone to help with editing, part-time to start. I told them about you." Nancy's chest tightened. "Ellie, I don't know. I've been out of that world for so long." "Don't talk yourself out of it," Ellie interrupted softly. "You know books. You love words. This could be your way back." For a moment, Nancy hesitated, fear prickling at her edges. She thought of Victor's voice, mocking her notebooks, calling them worthless scribbles. She thought of Lucille's disdain, the years of being silenced, reduced to nothing more than a provider. Could she really step back into a world she had abandoned decades ago? But then she remembered her mother's words in the dream. "Don't let them take your voice. It's still yours." Nancy exhaled slowly, reaching for one of the papers. The job description was simple: proofreading manuscripts, assisting with layout, answering phones. Modest work, but within it lay the possibility of something greater. She felt a flicker of excitement, tentative but real. Ellie smiled as she watched her friend scan the listing. "It's not about the paycheck, Nancy. It's about rebuilding, piece by piece." Nancy nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she set the paper down. "I want to try." Ellie leaned back, satisfied. "Then we'll go tomorrow. I'll drive you." Later that afternoon, Nancy sat at the desk in the guest room. Ellie had left a notebook and pen there, almost as if she had known Nancy would need them. The blank page stared up at her, both inviting and terrifying. She held the pen in her hand for a long time, her mind swirling with doubts. What if she couldn't do it anymore? What if the words wouldn't come? But slowly, her fingers loosened, and she pressed the tip to the paper. The ink flowed, shaky at first, then steadier. The words weren't perfect. They didn't need to be. What mattered was that they were hers. Nancy wrote until her hand ached, tears slipping down her cheeks as relief mingled with fear and joy. It felt like breathing again after years of suffocation. The notebooks Victor had destroyed were gone, but in this moment, she realized he hadn't taken her voice. The pen scratched across the page, the white expanse slowly filling. It was small, fragile, but it was a beginning. And for Nancy, that was enough. The publishing house sat in a narrow brick building downtown, its windows lined with books and posters of recent releases. Nancy paused on the sidewalk, her hands trembling as she smoothed her skirt. Ellie touched her arm, her voice steady. "Just be yourself. They're not expecting perfection. They're expecting you." Inside, the office buzzed with quiet energy. Stacks of manuscripts covered desks, the scent of ink and coffee filling the air. A woman in her 30s greeted Nancy warmly and led her into a small conference room. The interview was straightforward, questions about her experience with grammar, her ability to manage deadlines, her love for books. Nancy answered honestly, her voice faltering only once before she caught herself. When they asked why she wanted the job, she hesitated, then said simply, "Because I want to feel alive again." By the time she left, the editor smiled and said they would call her soon. It wasn't a promise, but it was hope. Ellie met her outside, grinning. "How do you feel?" Nancy exhaled, her shoulders loosening. "Terrified and excited, I think. I think I actually did it." They spent the afternoon driving around Springfield, touring modest apartments near downtown. Nancy ran her hand along the walls of each small space, imagining furniture she didn't yet own, quiet mornings with coffee and a notebook, evenings where no one shouted or demanded. It wasn't much, but it was hers. That night, back at Ellie's, the two women sat at the kitchen table with takeout containers between them. Ellie raised her glass of wine. "To your first day of freedom." Nancy clinked her glass against her friend's, a small smile breaking through. The weight on her chest hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. For the first time in decades, she felt the ground under her feet was her own. After dinner, Nancy returned to the guest room. She set her notebook on the desk, opened it to a blank page, and uncapped her pen. The words came slowly, but they came. Lines about pain, about loss, about rediscovering her voice. She wasn't hiding in the dark anymore, scribbling in fear. She was writing openly, claiming her space. Hours passed before she leaned back, her hand cramped but her heart light. The page before her was filled with her handwriting, jagged but alive. Then her phone buzzed. The name on the screen made her chest tighten. Victor. For a long moment, she stared at it, debating whether to let it ring. Finally, she answered, her voice calm. "What do you want, Victor?" His tone was slick, almost smug. "I found your notebooks. The ones you swore I threw away. Maybe I didn't get rid of all of them after all. We should meet. Talk." Nancy's stomach twisted, but she didn't let her voice shake. "Keep them. Burn them. Do whatever you want. They don't control me anymore." He chuckled darkly. "You'll regret saying that. You always do." She ended the call without another word, placing the phone face down on the desk. Her heart raced, but when she looked at the fresh page in front of her, the fear began to fade. Victor might still try to pull her back, but he no longer held the last piece of her. She had herself. Nancy lifted her pen again, pressing it firmly against the paper. The ink flowed, steady and sure. Her story was only beginning, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of how it would unfold. The night outside was quiet, the hum of the city distant. In the stillness, Nancy wrote on. Each were to step away from the shadows and toward the life she was finally ready to claim. The fight with Victor wasn't over, but the difference now was clear. Nancy wasn't fighting for scraps of dignity in his house. She was building her own. And in that small room, with nothing but a notebook, a pen, and her own resolve, she felt the unmistakable truth. Her new life had begun.